What if I told you the greatest empire the world had ever seen wasn't born from palaces, but from the endless wind-swept steppes, where horses ran faster than fear, and the horizon held more danger than hope? There were no roads, no cities, no safety, just clans fractured and fighting, and one vision burning brighter than fire: domination. The Mongols, a people born of survival, not birthright. Nomads, hunters, warriors, dreamers. They would sweep across mountains, deserts, and rivers, and change the face of the world forever. From scattered tribes to an empire that stretched farther than imagination. This is the story of rise, of conquest, of a legacy built on blood, law, and ambition. You'll witness how Genghis Khan forged a nation from chaos, how he turned warriors into generals, and generals into legends, how the Mongol horde became a storm no kingdom could withstand, from China to Persia to the gates of Europe. But even storms meet resistance. You'll meet the men who resisted, the kings who underestimated them, the alliances that formed and shattered. You'll see betrayal and loyalty in the same breath. Wars fought not just with swords, but with strategy that rewrote the rules of power. And yet the world would never be the same. You'll ride with them as cities fell before their might. Empires crumbled, kings vanished, and still, amidst the destruction, they built roads, they traded ideas, they governed with law, surprising, even to their enemies. The Mongols weren't just conquerors, they were the architects of a new world order. But this story isn't just about blood and fire. It's about people, about leaders, warriors, families, and the cost of ambition. You'll see moments of mercy, moments of cruelty, love, loss, betrayal, glory, and the consequences echo even today. The Mongol Empire shaped the continents. It connected east and west. It redrew borders. It spread knowledge, fear, and culture across a world that had never known such speed. And even as the empire fractured, its shadow lingered. A name, a legend, a force never forgotten. So if you think you know the Mongols, think again. The truth is larger than legend, more brutal, more human, and far more unforgettable. Subscribe, settle in, and prepare. Because this is not just history. This is the Mongol Empire. Cold, unforgiving, snow drifts across the endless Mongolian steppe. The land is white, silent, deadly. It is the year 1162. Winter has come early. Inside a small felt tent, a woman struggles to breathe. Her name is Holun, wife of Yasujii, a chief, a warrior. But her husband is not here. He is far away, riding under a black sky. Her hands clutch her swollen belly. The pain is sharp, unrelenting. Her tribe waits outside. Some whisper, some look away. There is no joy in their faces, only uncertainty. A child is coming, but the omens are not good. The tent door flaps open. A gust of frozen air swallows the warmth. A midwife enters. Her face is hard, weathered by a lifetime of wind and loss. She kneels beside Holun, whispers prayers, works in silence. Hours pass. The wind howls louder. The earth feels as if it is holding its breath. Finally, a cry. Thin, weak. A boy. Holun pulls him close. The midwife frowns. She sees it immediately. The boy's hand is clenched around a dark, dried clot of blood. The midwife knows the old belief. Children born clutching such a sign are destined for greatness or ruin. Holun stares into her son's eyes. They are sharp, unblinking, like a hawk's. She names him Temüjin, after a man his father had killed in battle. A name tied to blood, a name tied to violence. From the moment of birth, destiny clings to Temüjin like frost on the steppe. But destiny is cruel. Before the boy can walk, betrayal strikes. Yasujii, returning from war, meets a group of Tartars on the road. He shares food with them, a gesture of peace. But the meat is poisoned. Within days, Yasujii is dead. Holun's cries echo over the wind. The men of the tribe gather. They speak in low voices. Without a leader, they say the family is weak. One morning, they vanish, taking their herds, their food, their weapons. They leave Holun and her children alone on the steppe. No shelter, no horses, no mercy. Holun stands in the snow, clutching Temüjin to her chest. Her other children cling to her robe. The wind cuts through their bones. That night, she tells them, "We are alone now, but we will not die." She hunts with traps made of bone and sinew. She digs for wild onions in frozen soil. She teaches her children to survive on the marrow of animal bones. Temüjin learns quickly. The hunger becomes a part of him. So does the silence. Years pass. Temüjin grows into a boy with sharp eyes and a cautious tongue. But his life remains hard. Every winter is a battle. Every spring, they wonder if they will see summer. Then another blow. Temüjin's half-brother, Bektar, takes food without sharing. In the steppe, such theft is betrayal. It means death for the rest. Temüjin makes a choice, a terrible one. He and his younger brother, Kasar, ambush Bektar by the river. An arrow, a cry, silence. The body drifts in the water. Temüjin does not look away. He has learned survival is bought with blood. But the blood has a price. The killing marks him. The tribe whispers his name with fear. And when enemies come, no one warns him. One summer afternoon, the Temüjin, a rival clan, ride in. Dust rises from the plain like a storm. Temüjin runs, but they catch him. They bind him to a wooden kang, a heavy collar that chains the neck and hands. He is 13, a prisoner. Days under the burning sun, nights in the freezing dark. Children throwing stones at him, the taste of blood in his mouth. But Temüjin watches. He studies his captors, waits for weakness. One night, during a storm, a guard grows careless. Temüjin strikes. The man falls. Temüjin flees into the blackness. He hides in reeds, wades through icy rivers, runs until his lungs tear. When he returns to his family, his eyes are different, harder, older, as if he has lived 100 winters. Temüjin knows something now. No tribe, no family, no chief will protect him. Only he can protect himself. The boy is gone. In his place, a survivor. And survivors do not forget. Somewhere beyond the steppe, the men who poisoned his father still breathe. Temüjin has not yet met them, but he will. The wind does not pity the abandoned. It sings no softer for a child left alone. Temüjin was 9 years old when his father was poisoned. Poison, a quiet killer, a coward's weapon. Yasujii had been returning from arranging Temüjin's marriage when he stopped to share a meal with the Tatars. Old enemies, old grudges, and within the broth they served, death waited. By the time Yasujii staggered home, the poison had already begun its work. His eyes clouded, his breath faltered, and with him, the fragile power of his family crumbled. The clan, his father's warriors, the people who had once ridden at his banner, turned their backs. A boy could not lead them. A widow could not protect them. They left Holun Temüjin and his brothers to the wolves. Literally, there is no hunger like the hunger of abandonment. Winter bit the steppe. The family dug for roots, trapped small animals, and sometimes they simply went without. Their clothes were ragged. Their hands cracked from cold. The young Temüjin learned the taste of desperation, a taste that would linger all his life. He also learned something else, that loyalty was not a given. It was a transaction, and he would never again be too poor to pay for it. Among the scattered reeds of the Onan River, Temüjin's family struggled to survive. Every scrap of meat was fought over. Every handful of grain counted. Temüjin's half-brother, Bektar, was older, stronger, and ambitious. One day, he took food that was meant for the family. A theft in that bitter winter was more than selfishness. It was a death sentence for someone else. Temüjin made a decision that would stain his hands before he had even grown into them. He and his younger brother Kassar tracked Bektir down. The wind was sharp. The grass whispered. A bough was raised. Bektir fell without a word. It was not rage that drove Temüjin. It was necessity, a hard truth. On the steppe, a leader must be willing to kill those who threatened the survival of the group, even if they share your blood. It was his first act as a leader, and it made him dangerous. Leadership, however, paints a target on your back. The Temüjin tribe, rivals with a long memory, captured Temüjin. He was bound with a kang, a heavy wooden yoke that locked his neck and hands. The weight forced his head down. The wood dug into his skin. It was not just a restraint, it was a humiliation. They paraded him through camp like a prize animal. Children jeered. Warriors laughed. But the boy with the iron eyes did not bow in spirit. At night, under a sky pricked with stars, he planned. He studied the guards. He learned the patterns of their watch. One evening, when the camp was drunk and the fire burned low, Temüjin slipped away. He waded into the river, the cold swallowing his breath, the kang pulling at his neck like a drowning hand. But he kept moving, kept sinking into the reeds, until the darkness hid him completely. By morning he was gone, and the Temüjin would remember him not as a prisoner, but as a shadow that refused to be held. Freedom meant little without allies, and allies meant marriage. Temüjin traveled to the Angdurat, the people of his childhood betrothal. Borte, the girl promised to him years before, was now a young woman, calm-eyed, quick-witted. She saw in Temüjin not just the boy she'd once met, but the man he was becoming. They married under the vast, empty sky. Her dowry was a sable cloak, black as midnight, soft as sin. Temüjin would give this cloak away before the year was out, not for love, but for loyalty, gifting it to Togrul, Khan of the Karait, to seal an alliance. That was Temüjin's genius. He understood that wealth was useless unless it was spent buying people. Borte became more than a wife. She was his confidant, his political partner, and soon she would become the reason for his first great act of war. It happened quickly. One day they were together in the felt-walled warmth of their gur. The next, the Merkit tribe swept down like a black tide. They took Borte. The hoofbeats faded into the horizon, leaving Temüjin staring into the distance, his fists clenched until his nails cut skin. He rode for help, not to his own kin, but to his allies, to Togrul of the Karait, who owed him a favor, to Jamuka, his blood brother from youth. Together, they rode with 20,000 riders, a storm on horseback. The Merkit fell beneath them like grass before a scythe. Borte was returned, shaken but alive. From that day, Temüjin's enemies learned something. When he came for you, he would not come alone. And when he took back what was his, he would take something of yours as well, your warriors, your horses, your pride. The steppe had always been ruled by tribes bound by blood. A man's worth came from the name of his father, the size of his clan. Temüjin broke this rule. He began to gather men not by kinship, but by merit. A poor herdsman who proved himself in battle was worth more to him than a lazy noble. A craftsman who could build, a scout who could track, these were treasures. He reorganized his forces into units that mixed men from different clans, breaking the old loyalties and replacing them with loyalty to him alone. At a Kurultai, a great council, in 1206, the tribes declared him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The boy who had once eaten roots to survive now commanded tens of thousands. The hunger had never left him. It had only changed shape. The year was 1206. Winter had loosened its grip on the steppe, but the cold still lingered in the wind. Patches of snow clung stubbornly to the dark earth, like memories that refused to melt away. The Onan River, the lifeblood of the region, ran slow and heavy, its surface catching the pale sunlight in a silver shimmer. And on its banks they gathered. Banners flapped in the wind, stitched with the colors and symbols of dozens of clans. Horses stamped the ground, steam curling from their nostrils. Warriors in fur and leather clustered in groups, their voices a mix of guttural laughter, sharp commands, and low whispers. Some had ridden for days. Others had crossed rivers swollen with spring melt. All had come because a summons had been sent, not from a Khan of one tribe, but from a man who had taken tribe after tribe and bound them under his will. Temüjin. His name was no longer just a name. It was a rumor, a warning, a promise. For years he had fought, bargained, and bled to bring order to the chaos of the steppe. And now here he was about to bind the Mongols into something greater, something that had never existed before. But this was not just a political gathering. It was a Kyriltai, a sacred council, part military meeting, part spiritual rite. The air carried a strange tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Old rivalries had not vanished. Some clans came willingly, with loyalty in their eyes. Others came because they were beaten and had no choice. And a few came to watch, silently judging, waiting to see if this man truly deserved the title he sought. Temüjin stood apart from the noise for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had known hardship from birth, the murder of his father, the betrayal of his allies, the years spent in hunger and exile. Now, all those struggles had led here. Yet, instead of pride, he felt something else. Responsibility. He knew that today was not the end of his journey, but the true beginning. If he failed, the Mongols would scatter again like sand in the wind. When the moment came, he stepped into the circle of leaders. The Khatan, the wives of nobles, and the shamans stood nearby. An elder shaman approached with a staff carved from birch, topped with a tuft of white horsehair, a symbol of authority that predated any Khan. The ceremony began. First came the recitation of his deeds, how he had avenged his father, broken the might of the Temüjin, destroyed the Merkits, humbled the Tatars, and shattered the Naiman. Each name was spoken like a victory drumbeat, each battle a step toward this moment. Then came the formal declaration. A voice rang out over the gathered crowd. From this day, Temüjin is not only Khan of his tribe. He is Genghis Khan, universal ruler of all the Mongols. A cheer erupted, not a single sound, but a rolling thunder of voices. Men beat their shields. Horses reared. Women raised their hands toward the sky. And Temüjin, Genghis Khan now, felt the weight of the title settle on his shoulders like an iron mantle. He knew the truth. Titles meant nothing without the strength to defend them. But for now, the moment was his. The dream of a united Mongol nation was no longer just a vision in his mind. It stood before him, alive and breathing. The celebrations lasted into the night. Feasts of roasted mutton, fermented mare's milk passed from hand to hand, and stories retold by firelight. But the true work of the Kyriltai was not in the feasting. It was in the laws that followed. Genghis Khan called for silence. The murmurs faded, the crackle of the fires becoming the only sound. He spoke not just to the leaders, but to every man and woman who could hear his voice. The Mongols, he declared, would no longer be a loose web of clans bound only by blood feuds and temporary alliances. They would be one nation, bound by a code, the Yasa. The Yasa would touch every part of life. Loyalty to the Khan was absolute. Treachery would be punished by death. Theft of livestock, the lifeblood of the steppe, was a crime against the whole nation. Religious tolerance would be enforced. Shamans, Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims could all worship freely, so long as they swore loyalty. Military discipline was sacred. No warrior would abandon his unit, and no battle spoils would be claimed before the Khan's share was taken. It was not a democracy. It was not mercy. It was order, the kind the steppe had never truly known. The warriors listened in silence, and one by one, they gave their oaths. Hands were raised, promises made. To break such an oath was to break yourself. And everyone present understood that Genghis Khan would enforce his word without hesitation. When dawn broke, the river was quiet again. The campfires had burned down to embers. The banners hung still in the morning air. The Mongols were no longer just scattered tribes. They were now something entirely new, a single people under a single ruler. Genghis Khan mounted his horse and looked over the gathered warriors. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what could come next. The rival Khanates crushed, the borders pushed far beyond the steppe, the sound of Mongol hooves echoing across lands that had never even heard their name. But he also knew the truth. Uniting the steppe was just the beginning. Ahead lay enemies who would not yield easily. The Jin Empire to the south, the Khwarezm to the west, and countless others who thought themselves untouchable. The steppe had forged him. Now he would forge the world. He turned his horse toward the horizon. The others followed. And so, in the year 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, the Mongol nation was born, not in peace, but in the promise of war. The wind was sharp that morning. It rolled in from the Gobi, carrying the smell of dust and faraway rain, a scent the Mongols had learned to read like scripture. Some said it was the smell of opportunity. Others whispered it was the smell of trouble. Temüjin, now Genghis Khan, sat his horse high on a ridge, looking south. Below lay nothing but emptiness, a great sea of sand, broken only by jagged mountains and the faintest line of green where rivers clawed through the dust. Beyond that emptiness lay Xia, the Western Xia kingdom, rich, walled, and, perhaps most tempting of all, insultingly close. The Western Xia were no strangers to Mongol raiders. For years, nomad warbands had nipped at their borders, stealing livestock and vanishing into the steppe. But this was different. This was not a raid. This was Genghis Khan's first real test, as ruler of a united Mongol nation. He knew the risks. Xia's cities were fortified like nothing the Mongols had faced before. Thick walls of packed earth and brick rose high against the horizon, guarded by disciplined soldiers and elite cavalry. They had crossbows that could punch through armor at 200 paces, siege engines to hurl stones the size of a man's chest, and warehouses filled with grain to outlast long sieges. In their capital Yinchuan, nobles in embroidered silks likely dismissed the Mongols as just another wild tribe, loud, dangerous, but destined to fade back into the steppe. That was a mistake. The Khan had no intention of fading. He intended to break them, not just to win loot or tribute, but to announce to the world that the Mongols were no longer a scattered nuisance. They were a storm, and this would be their first thunderclap. Around him, his commanders waited in silence. Subutai, young and sharp-eyed, eager for his first taste of large-scale war. Jeeb, the arrow, whose cunning was matched only by his ruthlessness. And the seasoned generals, who had ridden with Temüjin since the days of mud, hunger, and betrayal. They all knew what was coming. A march south meant crossing hostile deserts, scaling mountains, and fighting on unfamiliar terrain. It meant testing the new army. Tens of thousands of riders from dozens of clans, drilled into a single war machine against one of China's proudest kingdoms. But it also meant the chance for glory. The Khan raised his gaze to the horizon, where the sun was bleeding into the sand. Xia, he said softly, almost as if to himself. Let us see if your walls can hold against the sky. The order went out. Banners snapped in the wind. Hooves thundered. And for the first time, the Mongol Empire rolled south like a wave, not to raid, but to conquer. The first march against Xia was not the sweeping cavalry charge of legend. It was a slow grind against a land that seemed to actively resent the presence of men. The Orkhon River Valley, so green and alive in summer, had given way to the edge of the Gobi. Here, the wind cut sideways, sharp enough to make a horse flinch. Sand and dust did not merely blow, they invaded. It settled in the folds of clothing, caked into the nostrils, coated the tongue. The Mongol army, so used to open steppe and rolling plains, had to learn a new rhythm, the rhythm of endurance. Xia's people were masters of endurance. They lived in a world of sun-baked walls, narrow streets, and fortresses that rose like jagged teeth from the desert floor. Their soldiers wore lamellar armor, thick layers of leather and iron stitched tight. Their arrows were shorter but heavier, designed to punch through armor at close range. And their kings had long dealt with enemies far larger than themselves. When Genghis Khan scouts reached the first Xia border posts, they found not scattered shepherds or poorly manned watchtowers, but garrisons alert and ready, banners snapping in the wind. The Khan understood immediately. This was not a raid. This was a chess match. The Mongol army advanced in waves. First came the light cavalry, testing defenses, loosing arrows from a distance, forcing the Xia soldiers to reveal firing positions. Then came the heavy cavalry, armored riders with lances lowered, smashing into any weak point the scouts found. But Xia's commanders were not easily provoked. They retreated when pressed, advanced when the Mongols overextended, and used the desert's narrow passes to funnel cavalry into kill zones. Every step forward cost blood. In the evenings, as the army made camp, the Khan walked among his warriors. He spoke with the men at the fires, listened to the grievances of those whose horses were weakened by the heat, and shared the same boiled mutton and salted tea they drank. The Mongols followed him not because he was untouchable, but because he was among them, suffering the same thirst, feeling the same dust grind between his teeth. At night, the desert changed its shape. The heat bled away, replaced by a cold that seemed to pierce bone. Stars burned sharp above, more numerous than a man could count. And somewhere beyond the flicker of the campfires, Xia's scouts moved in the dark, counting Mongol numbers, cutting supply lines where they could. By the end of the first year, the Khan had learned 3 things. 1. Xia could not be broken by one swift strike. Its walls were high, its warriors disciplined, and its people accustomed to scarcity. 2. The desert was as much an enemy as the Xia army. It killed slowly, without arrows or blades. 3. Patience would be the sharpest weapon. The first campaign had not yet ended, but the Khan already understood. To take Xia, he would need more than speed. He would need to become as relentless as the desert itself. The city of Zhongxing, capital of the Western Xia, did not rise like the cities of the West, with spires of marble or domes of gold. It was a fortress, a low sun-baked sprawl of thick earthen walls, built not for beauty, but for survival. It was said those walls could drink the heat of the desert and spit it back at you, until even your shadow sweated. And now, Genghis Khan stood before it. The Mongol army, dusty and weathered from weeks of marching through hostile terrain, finally looked upon their true prize. Xia's border garrisons had fallen one by one, their cavalry smashed in open battle, their supply lines cut. Now, the only thing between the Khan and total victory was this stubborn city. The Mongol way of war meets stone walls. Up until this point, the Mongols had fought where they excelled, in the open steppe, where speed and mobility were everything. But Zhongxing was a different animal. It sat behind thick ramparts and deep moats, with towers spaced so close together that any approach was met with a rain of arrows. For a moment, and only a moment, Genghis Khan hesitated. A frontal assault would cost lives. More importantly, it would cost time. And time was precious on the steppe. Armies lived off movement. If they stayed still too long, horses grew thin, supplies ran low, and enemies found courage. But the Khan was not about to let walls stop him. If the Mongols did not know how to take a city, then they would learn. Learning the art of siege. The Mongols had no tradition of siegecraft. Their own homeland had no fortresses, no cities worth defending with stone. But they were masters at stealing knowledge. They captured Chinese and Khitan engineers along the way, men who knew how to build catapults, traction trebuchets, and siege towers. In exchange for their lives, and in some cases, better food than the soldiers, these engineers taught the nomads how to batter down walls. Within days, the Mongol camp transformed. Logs were cut, frames assembled, ropes twisted from animal sinew. By night, fires lit the work yards as siege machines took shape, while the Xia defenders watched from the walls, wondering when the attack would begin. The Xia's desperation. Inside the city, the mood was grim. The rulers of Xia, the Tangut royal court, had underestimated the Mongols. They thought of them as desert raiders who would loot a border town and vanish. But now, their enemies had surrounded the capital, blocking all gates, cutting off food and water routes. The days grew hotter. The air inside the city tasted of dust and fear. Messengers rode out at night, trying to slip past Mongol lines and summon reinforcements from allied states. But most never returned. The first assault. The Khan ordered a test of strength. On the third week, siege engines rolled forward, crude but deadly. Boulders smashed into the walls, sending clouds of sand and clay into the air. Archers advanced behind wooden mantlets, unleashing arrow storms to pin down defenders. The defenders fought back fiercely, pouring boiling water, launching fire arrows, and beating war drums that echoed through the city. The Mongols were driven back, but they had learned what they needed. This would not be a war of speed. It would be a war of patience, and patience was something Genghis Khan could master when victory demanded it. You've been at war for over a year now. The men are tired. The horses are tired. Even your enemies are probably tired. And yet here you are, standing before the walls of Yinchuan, the Xia capital, wondering how in the name of the eternal blue sky you're supposed to break through. Because these walls, they're not just walls. They're mountains in disguise, thick, towering, unshakable, and behind them, tens of thousands of well-supplied defenders. On paper, this should be the part where you pack up and ride home. Except you're Genghis Khan. You don't do pack up and ride home. The uninvited river guest. Your army surrounds a city, cutting off supply lines. You expect the Xia to panic. They don't. Turns out they've been stockpiling grain for years. The only ones in danger of starving are your men. This is the moment where lesser leaders would give up. You decide to try something else, something extreme. You find the Yellow River. Yes, that massive, unruly beast of a waterway. And you get an idea. What if you redirected the river into the city? No, it's not as insane as it sounds. Actually, scratch that. It is exactly as insane as it sounds. Your engineers start digging channels. Your men pile up dirt and stones to divert the flow. It's backbreaking work. Horses sink in the mud. Men curse under their breath. And all the while, the Xia are watching from their walls, probably wondering if the Mongols have finally lost their minds. Water as a weapon. It takes days, but the channels begin to take shape. And then, one morning, the river starts to flow toward Yinchuan. At first, it's just a trickle, then a stream, then a full, roaring surge of muddy water slamming into the base of the walls. Inside the city, the streets begin to flood. Granaries are soaked, foundations weaken, horses drown in their own stables. You can almost hear the panic. The Xia try to counter it, digging their own drainage, building makeshift barriers. But the Yellow River doesn't play fair. It rises, it pushes, it rots the heart of the city from the ground up. And here's the irony. You don't actually want to destroy the city completely. You just want to make it miserable enough that surrender feels like the only sane choice. The breaking point. Winter bites hard. The flooded streets turn to ice. The Xia defenders, trapped between hunger and hypothermia, finally begin sending out envoys. They offer tribute, horses, silk, precious metals, but more importantly, they offer submission. The Xia king bows to your supremacy, agreeing to become a vassal state of the Mongol Empire. In return, you lift the siege, sparing the city from total destruction. It's a clean victory. No, scratch that. It's a perfect victory. You've tested your empire's strength against a fortified Chinese kingdom and proven that Mongol ingenuity is just as deadly as Mongol cavalry. And as your men ride home, the Yellow River quietly returns to its natural course, carrying with it the memory of the day Genghis Khan turned water into war. That rolled across the steppe in 1211 was not just carrying dust. It was carrying rumors. Rumors that the Jin Emperor, ruler of northern China, heir to a kingdom fattened by silk, tea, and taxes, had made the sort of mistake that, historically speaking, never ends well. He had insulted Genghis Khan. Not directly, of course. No emperor with self-preservation instincts ever sends a messenger saying, "Dear conqueror, kindly stay out of my empire." The insult came wrapped in political games, demands for tribute, attempts to stir Genghis's enemies, subtle reminders that the Mongols were, in the Jin court's eyes, still barbarians. The trouble was, Genghis Khan was not the sort of man you could call a barbarian and expect a Christmas card later. For years, there had been a delicate arrangement between the Mongols and the Jin. The Jin supplied gifts, Genghis supplied peace. A mutually convenient fiction. But peace is fragile. And when the Jin tightened their grip on the nomadic tribes along their border, cutting off trade, pressuring vassals, and flexing their armies, it became clear to Genghis that the arrangement was less friendship and more polite extortion. The final straw came when the Jin supported a rebellion against him. They did this under the assumption that Mongols would be too fractured, too busy fighting each other, to respond. It was the same assumption many would make over the next 15 years. Most of them would end up very, very dead. When word came of the Jin's treachery, Genghis called a Kurultai, the Grand Council of Mongol nobles. War, he told them, was inevitable. But the Jin weren't just some border kingdom. They were one of the richest empires in the world. Their cities were massive, their armies disciplined, their fortifications ancient and proven. Even for the Mongols, this was not a war to be rushed. And yet, in the middle of this calculated planning, Genghis couldn't help but savor the poetic symmetry. The Jin had once used Mongol tribes as pawns, turning them against each other. Now, those same tribes would unite under him and turn on the empire that had toyed with them. Spring of 1211, the steppe bloomed with the smell of thawing earth and the sound of hooves. Tens of thousands of Mongol horsemen gathered, a tide of riders whose discipline, speed, and sheer organization would soon terrify China. This was not a horde of drunken raiders. This was a mobile war machine. Each warrior had multiple horses, fresh mounts to keep the army moving without pause. Their bows were composite masterpieces, their armor light but effective. They could fight in the dead of night, in snow, in rain, in dust storms. The Jin army, on the other hand, was slower, heavier, and bound to its fortified cities. The Mongols knew it and intended to fight this war on their own terms. The first targets were not the great cities, but the outlying Jin garrisons and small fortresses. The Mongols moved like a ghost army, appearing, striking, vanishing before the Jin could mount a counterattack. Terrified survivors fled to the larger cities, spreading panic ahead of the Mongol advance. By the time the Jin court fully understood the scale of the threat, Genghis was already deep in their territory. This was not a raid. This was the opening act of a siege that would stretch over years, a war that would test both the Mongol war machine and the Jin dynasty's will to survive. And in the shadows of their palace, the Jin ministers began to whisper the same question that would haunt every enemy Genghis faced. How do you stop an army that never stops moving? The year was 1212, and the Mongol banners were no longer a rumor in Jin lands. They were an omen. Black horsehair streamers whipped in the wind. The horizon carried the thrum of hooves. And on every road, in every market square, people whispered the same thing: the Khan has come. The Jin dynasty had always seen the Mongols as unruly herders from a steppe, useful sometimes as border auxiliaries, dangerous if left unsupervised, but ultimately beneath the power of the Golden Empire. When Genghis Khan sent his first raids into their northern territories, the Jin court dismissed them as nothing more than a nuisance. But this was no cattle raid. This was the opening of a war that would pull the very bones out of northern China. Jin generals believed their salvation lay in walls. The dynasty's border was lined with a chain of fortified cities, stone citadels bristling with archers, their gates reinforced with iron. To a conventional army, it was a nightmare to breach. But Genghis Khan had no interest in marching straight into a wall. He understood a truth that the Jin seemed to have forgotten. A wall does not need to be broken to be bypassed. And so the Mongols began to flow around these fortresses like a river around boulders. They cut roads, ambushed supply caravans, burned farmland. They weren't just fighting an army, they were unweaving a country. By the winter of 1212, the Mongols tested their siege craft at Datong, a key city on the road to the Jin heartland. It was the first real clash between Mongol mobility and Jin stone. The defenders expected the steppe warriors to falter before the walls. Instead, Genghis brought Chinese defectors, engineers who knew the language of stone and fire. Trebuchets appeared, their long arms hurling boulders and fire pots. Siege towers creaked forward under a curtain of arrows. The defenders fought savagely, but here the Mongols learned something vital. Sieges were slow, costly, and frustrating. From then on, unless absolutely necessary, Genghis would prefer to starve a city rather than storm it. Where Mongol arrows could not reach, fear could. When a town resisted, its people were annihilated. When it surrendered, it was spared, and sent word ahead to the next city of what mercy and cruelty looked like, side by side. This psychological war became a weapon sharper than any sword. By the end of 1212, towns began to open their gates at the first sight of dust on the horizon. That winter, the Jin expected the Mongols to retreat to their steppe pastures. But the Mongols did not retreat. Snow lay heavy on the ground. Rivers froze solid. The Mongols simply switched their horses' feed from grass to stored grain, carrying the war deeper into Jin land at a time when no sane army would be in the field. For the Jin, this was the first real taste of what they were facing, an enemy who obeyed no season, a war that did not end when the year did. By the spring of 1213, the Jin Dynasty's northern defenses were splintering. The Mongols had learned the shape of the land, the weakness of the walls, and the rhythm of their enemies' heartbeat. The next phase would not just be raids. It would be a cutting out of the empire's heart. By the summer of 1214, the war between the Mongols and the Jin Dynasty had already burned through vast swathes of northern China. Cities had been besieged, fields trampled under the hooves of Mongol horses, and entire populations uprooted. Yet the jewel of the Jin realm, their capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, still stood. It would not stand for much longer. Facing relentless Mongol pressure, Emperor Xuanzong of Jin realized that his grip on the north was slipping like sand through his fingers. The Mongols had already taken Datong and other strategic fortresses. Trade routes were strangled, the countryside was in chaos, and famine whispered at the gates of the capital. In a desperate bid to save his throne, the emperor made an extraordinary decision. He would abandon Zhongdu entirely. In June 1214, the Jin court packed his treasures, loaded the imperial archives, and moved south to Kaifeng, leaving Zhongdu to be defended by generals and garrison troops. To Genghis Khan, this was an open invitation. The emperor had effectively declared the north lost. All that remained was to make it official, with fire and blood. When the Mongol armies encircled Zhongdu later that year, they faced a formidable fortress. Thick walls, deep moats, and thousands of defenders stood between them and victory. But Genghis Khan did not intend to waste his men in reckless assaults. Instead, he settled in for a siege, a slow, methodical suffocation. The Mongols cut off all supply lines, sealing the city like a jar. Inside, the people of Zhongdu prepared for a long winter. At first, the defenders fought back with crossbows and catapults, launching stones and flaming projectiles from the walls. But as the months passed, the real enemy was not the Mongols outside. It was hunger within. Rice became scarce. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Then dogs. Then rats. By the spring of 1215, starvation gnawed at every household. Those with strength left their homes to dig through frozen earth for roots and weeds. Corpses were quietly carried to mass graves or left in the streets. In May 1215, after nearly a year of siege, the walls of Zhongdu finally trembled. The Mongols had brought siege engines from the conquered Tangut lands, massive catapults capable of hurling stones that smashed through towers and gates. Once a breach was made, the Mongols surged into the city like a flood. The fighting was brutal. Jin soldiers fought street by street, but exhaustion and malnutrition had already decided the outcome. When resistance collapsed, the Mongols unleashed a sack that would be remembered for generations. The city burned for days. Palaces, markets, and temples were reduced to ash. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, and survivors were taken away as slaves. Zhongdu, once the proud capital of the Jin, was left a smoking ruin. The fall of Zhongdu shattered Jin authority in the north. What had begun in 1211 as a Mongol probing attack had now transformed into the near-total collapse of Jin control above the Yellow River. For Genghis Khan, it was proof that his armies could not only defeat nomadic rivals and frontier kingdoms, but also crush the great fortified capitals of China. The Jin were wounded, but not yet dead, and the Mongols were far from finished. The road south, deeper into the riches of China, now lay open. By the spring of 1215, the Jin Dynasty was a shadow of its former self. Years of Mongol raids had gutted its border defenses, its armies bled dry, its people scattered. Yet the heart of its empire still beat in Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, a colossal walled city of palaces, merchant districts, temples, and markets. Zhongdu was not just a city, it was a statement. Massive gray walls, 50 feet high, surrounded it like the ribcage of a sleeping giant. Watchtowers studded its ramparts. Behind those walls, the Jin emperor clung to his court's dwindling power, drowning in luxury while his generals scraped together the last fragments of an army. The Mongols had been here before. Years earlier, they had probed the city's defenses but lacked the numbers to take it outright. Now things were different. After systematically choking off Jin supply lines, Genghis Khan returned with an army ready for the kill. His generals, Subutai, Jeeb, Makali, commanded their own divisions, tightening the noose around Zhongdu like hunters driving prey into a trap. Starving the heart, Genghis didn't rush. He understood cities like this could not be broken by sheer speed alone. They needed to be smothered. For months, the Mongols cut every road, river, and gate that could feed Zhongdu. Caravans were captured, storage granaries burned. By midsummer, famine crept inside the walls. Witnesses later claimed you could smell Zhongdu's suffering before you saw it. The stench of uncollected waste. The sharp, acrid tang of bodies left to rot. In the palace, silk-clad nobles still dined on preserved delicacies, but in the streets, people fought over weeds growing between stones. The Mongols didn't just starve the city, they broke its will. Night after night, their war drums thundered outside the walls. Arrows carrying scraps of parchment rained down, warning the citizens, surrender and live, resist and be erased. The walls fall. By autumn, Zhongdu was brittle. A single fracture in its defenses could shatter it. That fracture came when Mongol engineers, many of them Chinese captives skilled in siegecraft, rolled forward enormous trebuchets and battering rams. Rocks the size of oxen slammed into the city walls, sending tremors through the ground. Towers splintered. The Jin defenders fought with desperate ferocity, but Genghis had patience. Each breach was widened over days until, in the winter of 1215, the Mongols poured through. What followed was less a battle and more a flood. Fire and silence. The sack of Zhongdu was one of the most brutal episodes of the Mongol conquest. Streets became rivers of ash and blood. Entire districts were set ablaze, flames licking the night sky. Palaces were looted, gold and silk carted away. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who surrendered were spared, temporarily. It was said that for weeks afterward, the land around Zhongdu lay silent, the air heavy with the smoke of a dead city. For the Jin Dynasty, this was not merely the loss of a capital, it was the loss of its heart. A message to the world. When the Mongols finally withdrew, Zhongdu was a gutted carcass, its glory stripped away. The Jin court fled south, clinging to survival in a much smaller, humiliated realm. Genghis Khan had proven something essential. No wall, no matter how high or thick, could keep the Mongols out forever. The fall of Zhongdu sent ripples far beyond China. Other kingdoms, Korea, the Western Empire, were watching, and they now knew what awaited those who refused Mongol demands. Genghis Khan's reputation was no longer that of a rising warlord. He was now a world-ending storm. And the storm was still gathering strength. The year was 1218. The Mongol Empire stretched like a great coiled bow across Asia, its string drawn tight, its arrow poised. Genghis Khan's realm now touched the borders of a new world, the Khwarezmian Empire. It was a wealthy land of silks and spices, mosques and markets, a bridge between China and the Middle East. Its cities glimmered under the desert sun, Samarkand, Bokhara, Urgench. A prize unlike any the Mongols had yet taken. But Genghis did not come with arrows drawn. Not at first. He came with traders. Caravans laden with furs, gold, and precious Chinese goods rolled westward, their camels plodding over dunes, their banners snapping in the wind. Genghis sent them as a gesture of friendship, a sign that the steppe could deal as well as it could conquer. They reached the Khwarezmian city of Otrar, and there things went wrong. The city's governor accused the merchants of being spies. Their goods were seized, their throats were cut, their bodies rotted in the marketplace, a message written in flesh and blood. Word reached Genghis. He did not scream. He did not rage. Instead, he sent 3 envoys to the Khwarezmian Shah, demanding justice. It was a chance for peace, or at least for dignity. The Shah responded by shaving one envoy's head, killing the others, and sending the survivor back to the Khan. That was the last mistake he ever made. The bow was drawn, the arrow was loosed, and the Mongols, once merchants, would now ride as avengers. The winter wind off the Seir Daria carried with it a promise of trade. It was 1218, and Genghis Khan had sent a caravan of hundreds, merchants, camels, fine silks, rare furs, and promises, westward to the Khwarezmian Empire. The Khan's offer was straightforward: friendship. The Mongols had tasted victory in China. Their horses were fat, their warriors rich with plunder. But there were things the steppes could not grow: precious metals, spices, textiles. And the cities of the Khwarezmians, glittering like mirages along the Silk Road, could supply them. The caravan arrived at the frontier city of Otrar, a jewel of minarets and mud brick, where east met west in a haze of spice smoke. The Mongols expected welcome. Instead, they found suspicion. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuq, known to his enemies as the Ear Cutter, saw not merchants, but spies. And so the first spark was struck. Inalchuq arrested the caravan. Their goods were seized. The men were executed. No message was sent to the Khan, only a quiet looting of silks and gold. When word reached Genghis, he did not rage. He calculated. This was not yet war, he told himself. Not if the Shah, ruler of Khwarezm, disavowed his governor and made amends. A delegation of 3 Mongol envoys rode west to seek apology. They carried no weapons, only the Khan's seal and his words: "I am master of the lands of the rising sun, you of the lands of the setting sun. Let us be brothers." The Shah's reply was neither brotherly nor wise. One envoy was executed. The other 2 were humiliated, shaved, beaten, and sent back. Genghis Khan listened to their account in silence. Then he stood, turned to his generals, and gave the words that would seal the fate of an empire. The Shah will have no brothers, only a grave. The winter wind over Central Asia bit like sharpened steel. Across the steppes, the Mongol banners moved, slow at first, like shadows stretching across the snow, and then faster, and faster still. Genghis Khan had decided: no treaties, no ransom, no negotiations, only retribution. But this was no blind fury. It was calculated, patient, and deliberate, the kind of vengeance that didn't just kill men, but erased entire cities from memory. The Mongol army split into multiple columns. They didn't march like a single tide crashing against the shore. They moved like water seeping into cracks, flowing down unexpected paths, striking where the enemy felt safest. Khwarezm cities, Otrar, Bokhara, Samarkand, lay ahead like pearls on a string, and the Khan intended to pluck them one by one. In the towns along the borders, whispers of the Mongols preceded the sound of their hooves. Merchants fled. Soldiers abandoned their posts. The Sultan, Muhammad II, tried to rally his forces, but distrust and panic were already eating his army from the inside. When the Mongols reached the first fortified walls, they didn't rush. They built siege machines, cutting down local forests with frightening speed. They encircled cities like a tightening noose, cutting off food, water, and hope. And when the gates finally fell, they made examples so severe that entire neighboring towns surrendered without a fight. This was not just war, it was theater, a performance meant for every ruler who might one day consider crossing Genghis Khan. The massacre at Otrar had lit the fire. Now, the flames were spreading across Central Asia, And nothing, no fortress, no army, no sultan could stop it. By the spring of 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was not so much a realm as it was a list of former cities. From the Caspian coast to the Sir Daria, Mongol banners hung where Khwarezm's crescent once flew. Markets were silent, mosques empty, walls reduced to heaps of broken brick. What Genghis Khan had unleashed was no mere punitive raid, it was an erasure. The Shah, Muhammad II, had fled months before, abandoning his subjects in a haze of panic. He darted from one fortress to the next, convinced the Mongols were at his heels. Every shadow on the horizon was an army, every rumor a death sentence. His final days were spent on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea, shivering in the salt wind, coughing himself into oblivion. No court, no army, no crown, just a sick man on a barren rock. But the Khan was not done. Muhammad's son, Jalal ad-Din, tried to rally what was left of Khwarezm's forces, scraping together warriors from shattered garrisons. He fought bravely at the Battle of the Indus in late 1221, even forcing the Mongols into a rare, momentary retreat. But Genghis was patient. He knew that even the fiercest resistance could be outlasted. Jalal ad-Din was eventually forced to flee into India, leaving his father's empire in Mongol hands. By the year's end, Central Asia lay bare before Genghis Khan. The Silk Roads now carried his messengers, his merchants, his soldiers. The Khwarezmian disaster was not just a victory. It was a lesson to the world. Betray the Khan at your peril. And somewhere in the quiet steppe, Genghis turned his gaze to the west. Dust did not settle for days. It hung over the horizon like a shroud, a brown-gray curtain pulled across the sky. For the people of Samarkand, it was not the sun they saw that morning, but the coming storm, a wall of riders, banners, and hooves. Samarkand was not a small town. It was a jewel of the Silk Road, a hub of wealth and trade. High walls circled its markets, its mosques, and its thousands of houses. Merchants whispered of its riches. Scholars spoke of its libraries. It was a place that believed it could stand against the world. But the world was already at its gates. The Mongols had come west like a plague wind. After the betrayal of the Khwarezm Shah, Genghis Khan had ordered no mercy. This was not conquest for gold. This was punishment. A message to every city from the Caspian to the Yellow Sea. Samarkand's defenders numbered in the tens of thousands, Khwarezmian troops, Persian archers, and even war elephants clad in armor. They had seen Mongol arrows in the distance for weeks, had heard the rumors of what happened in Otrar, in Bokhara. Some laughed them off. Others sharpened blades in silence. And then the horns sounded. The Mongols encircled the city in a single day. They cut the roads, the wells, the escape routes. For every 1,000 defenders inside, there were 5,000 Mongols outside, waiting. The siege began with thunder, catapults hurling stones, siege bows launching arrows in clouds so thick they darkened the air. From the walls, Samarkand soldiers fought back fiercely. War elephants charged out in a desperate sally, their tusks armored, their riders firing down into Mongol ranks. For a moment, the defenders roared in triumph. And then the Mongols answered. Drums pounded. Mounted archers spread out, loosing arrows at the elephants' eyes and feet, blinding them, driving them mad. The beasts turned in terror, trampling their own troops in the chaos. The roar of victory turned into screams. Inside the city, panic began to spread. The food stores would not last. The wells were already poisoned. The Mongols were patient. They did not need to break the walls. They only needed to wait until the city broke itself. At night, the people could see the glow of Mongol campfires stretching to the horizon. The stars were hidden by smoke. No messenger escaped the siege. No mercy would come from the east, the west, or anywhere at all. Samarkand was alone. The walls of Samarkand had seen invaders before. Persians, Arabs, Turks, each had come with banners and blades, and each had left their mark. But never had the city faced anything quite like this. The Mongol army arrived in March 1220, a black tide rolling over the hills, their banners whipping in the wind, their horses stamping the earth into dust. from the ramparts. The defenders could see them stretching to the horizon. Thousands upon thousands of riders, each armored in leather and iron, each face hidden behind the same cold discipline. Inside the city, panic spread like fire through dry grass. The governor, a former Khwarezmian general, tried to rally the garrison. Samarkand boasted tall stone walls, deep ditches, and a population of over 100,000. Surely they could hold. Surely the city was too rich, too proud to fall. But the Mongols had a way of making walls irrelevant. They didn't charge recklessly at the gates. They didn't waste their strength on a single frontal assault. Instead, they encircled Samarkand like a tightening noose. The Mongol siege machines, massive Chinese-built catapults and siege towers, were rolled into position. Stones the size of oxen slammed into the walls with bone-shaking force. Arrows rained down day and night, giving the defenders no rest. And then came the real blow, treachery from within. Samarkand was home to a large contingent of Turkish soldiers, once loyal to the Khwarezmian Shah, but now disillusioned. These men opened the gates to the Mongols. In a single moment, the city's defenses unraveled. The Mongols poured in like water through a breach, cutting down resistance street by street. The governor fled to the citadel, but even there was no safety. After a brief siege, he surrendered. Genghis Khan entered Samarkand not as a plunderer in a frenzy, but as a ruler conducting business. The population was divided. Craftsmen and scholars were spared and sent east to serve the empire. Soldiers and officials were executed. The rest were enslaved. By the end, Samarkand was a hollowed-out shell, its bazaars emptied, its gardens trampled, its streets lined with the dead. What had been one of the wealthiest cities of the Silk Road was now another grim trophy in Genghis Khan's relentless advance. And still, the Mongols were not done. Bokhara was next. They called it a city of poetry. Nishapur, a jewel of Khorasan, wrapped in gardens and song, with markets thick with saffron and turquoise. A place where lovers met under the apricot blossoms and scholars argued in the cool shadow of the madrasa walls. It was said the air itself carried the perfume of roses in spring. It would soon carry something else. By 1221, the war with the Khwarezmian Empire was no longer a war. It was a slow, deliberate extinguishing. Each city taken was not simply conquered, it was made an example. And no example would burn brighter in Mongol memory than Nishapur. The spark came in Herat, but the flame reached Nishapur through blood. Here's how the story went. Temüjin, Genghis Khan's youngest son, commanded the forces in Khorasan. Among his generals was a man named Temüjin, who had married into the Khan's family. In one of the sieges, Temüjin was killed, not by chance, but by an arrow from Nishapur's walls. The news traveled fast. Faster still was the rage that followed. When word reached Temüjin, his eyes went cold. But when it reached Temüjin's widow, Genghis Khan's daughter, cold was not the word. She demanded vengeance not in battle, but in totality. Her order was simple: leave no living thing in Nishapur. And so the city that once sang was encircled by silence. The Mongols cut the roads, broke the gates, and poured in like a black tide. House by house, street by street, they went about their work. Not in haste, not in fury, but with a terrible mechanical precision. The chronicles say that in the days that followed, the ground outside Nishapur rose into mounds, not of earth, but of skulls. Men, women, children, even the animals. The execution was so complete that it blurred the line between war and extermination. When it was over, the city's libraries lay in ash. Its gardens, once heavy with fruit, were trampled and blackened. The poets who had woven verse in Nishapur's coffee houses were silent forever. What had taken centuries to build was turned to dust in less than a week. And yet, if you ask the Mongols, this was not cruelty. It was justice. It was message. A warning carved into the bones of an entire city, meant to echo down the trade roads to every ruler who still dared to resist. In the deserts beyond, travelers spoke of Nishapur not in the past tense, but in whispers, as if the ghosts might still be listening. Bokhara was a city of merchants and mosques, of long-shadowed bazaars where the smell of cumin and roasting lamb hung heavy in the air. Its minarets had watched centuries pass. Empires rise, empires crumble. It was the pride of the Khwarezmian West. And in early 1220, it woke to silence. The Mongols had not simply marched here. They had appeared, sudden, impossible, as if conjured out of the winter steppe. Genghis himself rode at the head, flanked by his most trusted generals. He had not taken the direct road, nor the one anyone was watching. His army had crossed a frozen desert no sane commander would attempt. Bokhara's garrison never expected them. By the time the city understood, it was too late. The gates fell without a proper siege. Many of the defenders had already fled to the citadel, abandoning the outer streets. The rest surrendered quickly, hoping for mercy. But mercy was not the Mongol way, not for those who defied them. The people were driven into the main square. Merchants who had once haggled over bolts of silk now stood with their heads bowed, their ledgers useless. Women clutched children. Old men stared at the ground. And into this uneasy quiet, Genghis Khan rode. He dismounted before the great mosque. For 3 days, it would not be a place of prayer, but the Mongol headquarters. The carpets were rolled up to make space for their saddles. The courtyard echoed not with the call to prayer, but with the clang of weapons being repaired. And then came the speech, calm, cold, deliberate. Genghis told the trembling crowd they were not victims, but witnesses. Witnesses to what happens when the will of the great Khan is defied. It was not a rant nor a roar, but a simple statement of inevitability. The city's artisans, scribes, armorers, stonecutters were spared, marched away in chains to serve the empire. The rest were given to the soldiers. Looting followed like the tide after the moon. By the time the sun set on the 3rd day, Bokhara was stripped bare. Gold and grain, horses and slaves, all gone. Its minarets still stood, but their shadows now fell across streets where no voices rose. The city had not just been conquered, it had been emptied. They said the city of Nishapur had walls so thick 2 horsemen could ride abreast atop them. They said the markets glittered with silverware, silk, and the hum of poetry. They said the people were proud, cultured, untouchable. The Mongols heard all of this. And then they came. The story begins with an arrow. Not just any arrow, but one loosed from behind a crumbling parapet, striking Temüjin, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, straight through the neck. He fell before the walls of Nishapur, and with him, whatever chance the city had of mercy. Genghis was away, leading campaigns farther west. The siege of Nishapur fell to Temüjin, his youngest son, and to Genghis's daughter Khotan, Temüjin's widow. If Genghis was a storm, they were lightning and wildfire. Khotan demanded vengeance. Not surrender, not plunder, erasure. When the gates finally splintered, the Mongols poured in, not as conquerors, but as executioners. Street by street, house by house, they moved like a tide that did not recede. The chroniclers say the killings lasted days. Others claim the earth shook from the tramp of boots and the fall of bodies. The order was given, kill everyone, men, women, children. The tally is impossible to verify. Some say 90,000, others claim over 1.7 million. The numbers blur into the horror. What matters is the intent. The bodies were stacked outside the city in pyramids, heads separate from torsos. The air grew so thick with rot and dust that no bird would fly overhead. In time, the city was nothing but an empty shell, its streets lined with silent doorways, its wells choked with the dead. Nishapur, the jewel of Khorasan, had been unmade. And with it, the Mongols sent a message that traveled faster than any scout. Resist and cease to exist. The wind of the steppe howls. Snow drifts across an endless plain. And in the distance, riders appear. They are coming home. It had been years since Genghis Khan had last set foot in the land of his birth. Years of blood, of conquest, of breaking kingdoms to dust. Now, the war in the West was done. The Khwarezm Empire lay in ruin, its Shah dead, its cities reduced to ash. The men rode eastward with the trophies of empire and the ghosts of it. Genghis rode ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the winter light bent and shimmered. He was older now. Lines on his face cut deep like the scars across his body. But his back was straight, his gaze unbroken. The steppe had changed. Villages he remembered were gone. The grasslands seemed wider, emptier, as if the land itself had been holding its breath, waiting. When he finally crested the last hill before Burkhan Khaldun, he stopped. The sacred mountain rose against the pale sky. Here, the spirits of his ancestors waited. Here his life had begun. He did not dismount. He closed his eyes, and in the silence he remembered the boy who had hidden in the trees, hunted by enemies. The boy who had sworn he would never bow again. The boy was gone. Only the Khan remained. Word spread across Mongolia. The Khan had returned. Tribes that had once been scattered and divided now rode to meet him, banners snapping in the wind. At Karakorum, the heart of the empire, a great Kurultai was called. Leaders came from the far corners, from the forests of the north, the deserts of the west, the river valleys of China. Some were battle-hardened generals. Others were new lords, risen from nothing. They gathered in a wide circle, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow. Genghis sat at the center. He did not smile. His presence was enough. When he spoke, his voice was low, but it carried to the edges of the gathering. He spoke of unity, of law, of order. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a shepherd of a vast and restless land. The wars had forged the empire. Now it had to be held. In the months that followed, Genghis turned from war to governance. The Yasa, the great law of the Mongols, was renewed. It was simple, ruthless, and absolute. No theft, no betrayal, no disobedience to the Khan. Punishment was swift, mercy rare. But the Yasa was not only fear. It bound the tribes together. It made a herder in the Orkhon Valley answer to the same justice as a general in Karakorum. Messengers on swift horses carried orders across the empire. Relay stations, yam posts, were built every 25 miles, stocked with food, fresh horses, and guards. News could now cross Mongolia in days instead of weeks. In the markets of Karakorum, goods from Persia lay beside silks from China. The empire's veins were open, and the blood of trade began to flow. But unity came at a cost. Genghis had to look to succession, and his sons were not the same men. Joki, the eldest, had fought bravely in the west, but rumors still whispered that he was not truly Genghis blood. Chagatai despised him and said so openly. Ogidi, the third son, was steady, loyal, but not as fierce. The tension was a shadow in the Khansgur. At night, the fire crackled, and silence stretched between the brothers. Even their mother, Borte, could not bridge the distance. Genghis knew the unity of the tribes meant nothing if his sons tore it apart. A choice would have to be made, but not yet. While reforms spread through the empire, news came from the east. The Jin Dynasty was stirring. The Xia, humiliated and bound by treaty, were restless. And from the far west, messengers spoke of strange armored horsemen, unlike any the Mongols had seen before, moving beyond the Caspian Sea. Genghis did not flinch at the news. Every threat was a map to a new war. But he knew the truth. Even the greatest empire can fracture from within before an enemy strikes from without. In the spring of 1224, Genghis rode alone to Burkhan Khaldun. No guards, no banners, only the sound of his horse's hooves on the damp earth. At the summit, he dismounted. The wind tore at his cloak. He looked down at the vast green sweep of the steppe, his steppe, and yet it still felt borrowed, as if it belonged to the spirits more than to him. He knelt, pressed his forehead to the earth, and he prayed, not for victory, but for clarity, for the wisdom to leave behind more than just a memory of blood. By winter, the question could no longer be delayed. The Kurultai gathered again. The sons stood before the Khan. The air was thick with tension. Every lord watched. Every man knew this choice would shape the empire's fate. Genghis looked at each of them in turn. At Joki, proud, distant. At Chagatai, fierce, unyielding. At Ogdi, calm, steady. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. Ogdi will succeed me. No one moved. No one spoke. But the decision was final. It was not the strongest son, nor the most cunning, who would inherit the throne, but the one the Khan believed would keep the empire whole. The lords swore fealty again. The tribes renewed their loyalty. And the Khan's reforms, the laws, the trade routes, the courier system, were set like iron into the empire's frame. That night, a fire burned high in Karakoram. The smoke rose into the dark, carrying prayers to the sky. Genghis stood apart from the celebration. He watched the flames and felt the weight of years pressing on him. The wars had been his life, but perhaps these reforms, this unity, would be his true legacy. Spring came early in 1225. The grass grew tall. The rivers ran high. From the hills, the empire... But peace is never still for long. In the west, unknown kingdoms waited. In the east, old enemies gathered strength. And in the heart of the empire, the Khan's own bloodlines carried seeds of future storms. Genghis mounted his horse. His eyes narrowed on the horizon. The world was not yet finished, and neither was he. The summer sun burned white over the Ordos desert. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The Mongol banners moved slowly, heavy with heat. Ahead lay the Tangut kingdom, Xia, the last defiant ember in the west of China. Years ago, they had bent the knee. Now, they had broken their oath. For Genghis Khan, that was unforgivable. He rode at the head of his army, silent. Every hoofbeat stirred the dry earth. The Tanguts had sought allies, the Jin, the Song, but no one had come. They would stand alone. Genghis was 65. The lines on his face were carved deeper than the canyons around them. But his eyes still burned like they had when he was a boy on the run. The wind carried the scent of sand and blood. And somewhere in that wind, he felt the pull of fate. That night, the campfires burned low. The moon was a thin blade in the sky. An old shaman approached the Khansgar. He did not bow. He simply spoke. The spirits walk close tonight. Genghis said nothing. He had learned long ago that the steppes spoke in ways men did not understand. But deep in his chest, there was a heaviness, like the air before a storm. The Mongols struck at dawn. The Tangut fortress rose from the desert like a scar of stone. Siege engines rolled forward. Arrows blackened the sky. The roar of war filled the air. Genghis rode the lines, his voice carrying above the chaos. Men fought harder when he watched them. For 2 days, the Mongols pressed the attack. Walls fell. Streets ran red. But in the frenzy of battle, something happened. Some say he was thrown from his horse. Others whisper he took a wound from an enemy blade. No one knows for certain. All that is known is this: when night came, the Khan did not rise easily. In the quiet of his gur, Genghis sat alone. His armor lay on the floor, dark with dust and blood. His breathing was slow. A stiffness crept into his body. It was nothing, he told himself. He had fought through worse. He was the man who had crossed half the world without breaking. He was Genghis Khan. But the fever came in the night. Cold sweats. A weight in his chest that would not lift. Even weakened, he commanded the siege. Orders left his lips with the same iron certainty as before. The Tanguts would be destroyed. That was the promise. Messengers came with news. The city was close to falling. The army was ready for the final push. But when they looked at him, they saw it. The Khan's strength was slipping. He had lost weight. His voice was softer. Only his eyes refused to change. In the dim light, his generals gathered. Subutai, Jeeb, Talyui. The question was unspoken, but it was there. What happens when the Khan can no longer lead? No man dared say it aloud. Not yet. The orders remained clear: finish the siege, leave no Tangut alive. This was not mercy. This was lesson. The walls cracked. The gates burned. The Mongols poured in. What happened next would be remembered in whispers: the slaughter of an entire people. Men, women, children. The Tangut name was to be erased. The Khan's will have been carried out. But as the smoke rose over the desert, the man who had ordered it lay on his bed, staring at the tent's roof as if looking beyond it. When the victory was certain, Genghis called for his horse. Against the protests of his sons and generals, he mounted. They say he rode to a quiet rise overlooking the smoldering ruins. He sat there for hours, unmoving, watching the black plumes curl into the sky. Perhaps he was thinking of the beginning, the boy Temüjin, hunted and hungry. Perhaps he was thinking of the end, the empire that would stretch beyond the reach of any horizon. When he returned to camp, he could not dismount without help. The fever raged. The tent was kept dark. The great conqueror lay beneath furs, his breath shallow. His sons came. Ogidi knelt at his side. Chagatai and Taiyue stood behind him, silent. Joki was not there. The Khan's voice was weak but steady. He spoke of unity, of holding the empire together, of never forgetting that the strength of the Mongols was not in the sword, but in the bond between brothers. Then, in a whisper, he spoke a final order. His burial was to be secret. No one would know where he lay. The land itself would guard him. That night, in the summer of 1227, the earth shook, not from battle, but from the passing of a man who had bent it to his will. Genghis Khan was gone. The next day, the camp was silent. No drums, no horns, only the wind. The body was placed on a black cart, covered in felt. A small escort rode with it, chosen men sworn to secrecy. They say they killed every living thing they passed, so no one could speak of the route. They say rivers were diverted, forests planted, to hide his grave forever. Some believe he rests at the foot of Burkhan Khaldun. Others say he lies in the heart of the steppe, beneath the open sky. No one knows. And that was his will. The empire did not break. Not yet. Ogidi would take the throne, as his father had commanded. But the man who had united the tribes, crushed kingdoms, and carved a path across continents was now only a story, only a shadow on the steppe. And yet, the shadow was vast. The wind sweeps across an endless plain. Somewhere unseen, a lone horse stands over an unmarked mound of earth. The sky is dark with storm clouds. The air is heavy, as if the land remembers. Because it does. The great white tent stood in silence. Its center was bare. Only a low dais marked where Genghis Khan had once sat. The empire waited. On the steppe outside Karakorum, the Kurultai gathered, princes, generals, shamans. The air was sharp with the smell of horses and frost. When Ogidi entered, all eyes followed him. He did not stride like his father. His gait was slower, his face rounder, his voice softer. But when he spoke, it was steady. I will carry my father's will. I will not break what he built. The oath was made. The white felt was laid on his shoulders. Ogidi Khan rose. From the first day, the burden pressed on him. This was not the rule of a tribe. This was a world-spanning empire, restless, hungry. Envoys came from every horizon. From the Jin in the east, trembling in their cities. From the Khwarezmian remnants in the west, still hunted. From distant princes who had never seen the steppe, but now called him master. Ogidi listened. He drank deeply from his father's counsel, still alive in memory. Do not stop moving. A still empire rots. In 1230, the drums of war began again. The Jin Dynasty, weakened, surrounded, was still standing. Ogidi would finish what Genghis had begun. The Mongols crossed frozen rivers. Battering rams crushed gates. Walls fell. By 1234, the Jin were gone. Northern China lay open, a jewel in the Mongol crown. But this was not enough. The eyes of the Khan now turned west. It was winter when the war council met. Maps were spread on low tables, weighted with daggers. Names were spoken: Volga, Rus, Hungary, Poland. Subutai, the great strategist, traced lines across the maps like wounds. We will strike them all at once. Swift, hard, before they understand. Batu, grandson of Genghis, would command the Western Army. Ogidi would remain in Karakorum, the heart of the empire, holding the reins. The plan was set. The steppe would thunder into Europe. The campaign began in 1236. Snow covered the forests of the Volga. The Mongol columns moved like a living shadow. The cities of the Rus fell one after another. Ryazan burned. Vladimir burned. Kiev, proud Kiev, burned. No mercy. No hesitation. The western gates of the world were breaking. In 1241, the Mongol armies surged beyond the Carpathians. Two great strikes, one toward Poland, one toward Hungary. At Legnica, the Mongols shattered the Polish knights. At Mohi, on the Sejo River, they crushed the Hungarian host. Europe reeled. The Pope called for unity. Kings whispered in fear. The Mongols stood at the threshold of the West. And then the messenger came. A lone rider, frost in his beard, dust in his eyes. He brought word from Karakorum. The Khan was dead. Ogdi had not fallen in battle, but in drink. The man who had ruled for 12 years, who had sent the Mongols farther than ever before, had collapsed in the heart of the steppe. Batu and Subutai read the message in silence. They knew the law. When a Khan dies, the princes return for the Kurultai. Even the greatest campaign must stop. The Mongol armies pulled back from the edge of Europe. The knights who watched them go did not understand. They thought it was fear. It was not. It was the iron law of the steppe. The throne could not remain empty. The dream of Europe's conquest would wait. Far from the battlefield in Karakorum, the end had been quiet. Ogdi had ruled with less fire than his father, but with the same relentless will to expand. He had built cities, repaired roads, and opened markets that spanned continents. But he had also drowned himself in drink. On a winter night in 1241, his heart had simply stopped. As the empire's armies returned, the question rose like a storm. Who would rule next? Ogdi's death had not shattered the empire, not yet. But the unity of the Mongols was a fragile thing. Brothers, sons, cousins, all had claims. And in the silence left by the Khan, ambition began to whisper. The steppe at dusk, a single rider moving toward the horizon. Behind him, the empire stretches like a sea. Ahead, a storm. The legacy of Genghis still rides. But the reins are slipping. Was silent. Only the wind moved. Batu Khan stood at the center of the encampment. To his right, Subutai, the great strategist. To his left, the princes of the golden lineage. Before them stretched a sea of black tents. 200,000 warriors. The might of the Mongol Empire in one place. Subutai's eyes scanned the horizon. "We ride west," he said, "and the world will know our name." The first blows came in winter. The Volga froze under iron hooves. Ryazan fell in fire. Vladimir burned next. At every gate, the Mongols came like a storm, swift, unrelenting. Kiev stood proud, its golden domes catching the sun. But pride did not stop the siege. Walls shattered under rams. Streets drowned in blood. When the fires died, Kiev was a carcass. Its bells lay cracked in the snow. In 1241, the Mongol tide split. One arm swept north into Poland. The other carved south toward Hungary. Subutai had drawn the plan like a net, baiting armies, cutting retreat, striking from the flanks. In Poland, the knights gathered at Legnica. Steel glittered. Banners waved. The Mongols rode in silence. The battle was swift. The knights broke. The Polish plain was left littered with shields and broken lances. Hungary was different. King Bela had called every warrior he could muster. Tens of thousands stood behind the Sejo River, believing the Mongols would break on their defense. At night, Subutai's plan unfolded. One army struck the bridge head-on. Another crossed the river in silence, moving through the dark. At dawn, the trap closed. The Hungarian host was crushed between two walls of horsemen. By nightfall, Mohi was a graveyard. Beyond Hungary lay Austria, Germany, the heart of Europe. The roads were open, the cities unprepared. Scouts rode as far as the Adriatic. Messages raced to Rome, to Paris, to London. The Mongols are coming. Kings whispered of a last crusade. But the shadow fell before the sword. It was late in the year when the lone rider came. He rode day and night, his horse staggering under him. He carried a message sealed with the black tamga. Genghis Khan was dead. Badu read it twice, his face still a stone. The law of the steppe was unbreakable. The princes must return to choose the next Khan. Europe's gates stood open, and the Mongols turned away. It was not a retreat of the defeated. It was the turning of a tide by choice. Villages that had prepared for war found only silence. Armies that had braced for the charge saw nothing but empty roads. The greatest invasion Europe had ever known vanished into the east. The lands they left were scarred. Cities lay in ruins, fields blackened, whole kingdoms shaken to their core. But the Mongols were not finished. This was a pause, not an end. Somewhere, deep in the steppe, the throne waited, and the empire would decide who next would lead the horsemen of the apocalypse. The plains of Hungary under snow. No armies, no sound, only the memory of thunder. The West had been spared, but not by its own strength. The steppes were quiet the day Monk took the throne, not with peace, but with the weight of inevitability. The Kurultai had spoken. Genghis's blood still ruled. Monk's eyes were not those of a dreamer. They were steady, patient, like a hawk watching its prey from high above. He had inherited an empire that touched oceans, but he looked south to the last great prize, China. The Southern Song were no strangers to Mongol steel. They had watched the North fall, one dynasty after another, but the Yangtze River had kept them safe. For decades, its waters had been a shield. Now, Monk meant to break it. He sent word to his brothers, Kublai in the east, Hulagu in the west. Each would carry the Mongol name deeper into enemy lands. But the heart of the storm, that would be here, in the rice fields, the river valleys, the fortresses of the south. The Mongol army moved like a shadow across the mountains. Hooves struck the frozen earth in unison. Drums beat a slow, inevitable rhythm. Cities along the way bent or burned. Garrisons fell without glory, some from fear, others from betrayal. The Southern Song's border forts were stone teeth. But stone, Monk knew, could be ground to dust. Jiaoyu Fortress stood like a crown on a high cliff. It commanded the river. It commanded the land. The Mongols surrounded it. Siege towers rose, swaying in the wind. Song defenders fired from the walls, arrows dark as rain. The smell of burning pitch choked the air. For months, the fortress held. Every assault was thrown back with fire and steel. Monk watched from his command tent. He was patient, but the fortress mocked him with its endurance. 1257. The southern heat wrapped the Mongol soldiers in sweat and sickness. The Song fought not with open plains, but with rivers, forests, and weather. Every advance meant mud to the knees, leeches in the streams, diseases in the camps. Still, the Mongols pressed forward. Kublai took city after city in the east. Monk drove at the heart, aiming to cut the Song in two. But the enemy's spirit refused to break. Summer of 1259. The Yangtze swelled with rain. The Mongols stood before Azhou, the jewel of the river. Monk ordered the attack. Battering rams pounded at the gates. Siege engines hurled stones that cracked walls like thunder. The Song fought with the desperation of those who had nowhere left to run. Night after night, fires lit the riverbanks, turning the water red and gold. It began with a fever. The Khan's physicians whispered in his tent. Some said it was sickness from the river. Others, a wound gone foul. For days, Monk lay on his bed, hearing the battle in the distance. Drums, shouts, the crash of siege stones. He had crossed mountains and rivers to claim this victory. Now, he would not live to see it. In August, Mongkhan, grandson of Genghis, was dead. The Mongol banners dipped low. The army halted its assault. From the walls of Azhou, the Song watched the riders pull away, their war engines abandoned. They did not cheer. They knew this was not the end. The empire of the steppes had lost its master. But the war was only sleeping. Kublai received the news in the east. Hulagu in the west. Both turned their armies back toward Mongolia. The steppe demanded a new Kurultai, a new Khan to hold the empire together. The rivers of the south ran quiet again. But beneath that calm, the southern song knew the truth. The Mongols would return, and when they did, the river would no longer save. The steppes stretched endless under a cold sky. In the center, the Kurultai banners swayed. Monk Khan sat in silence. Around him, princes of the blood, Kublai, Hulagu, Erik Bok, waited. The council had spoken. The empire of Genghis now rested on Monk's shoulders. His gaze was steady, not fierce like Bada's, not restless like Kublai's. Monk was a stone in the river, unmoved by the current. But the current was about to turn south. China was not whole. The north had fallen to the Mongols decades before. But the southern song still ruled beyond the Yangtze. A wealthy kingdom, crowded cities, rivers that wound like silver dragons through the land. They had survived by trade, tribute, and the river's shield. Now Monk meant to shatter that shield. The command went out. Kublai would strike from the east, Urien Kadai from the mountains in the west, and Monk himself at the center to break their heart. 1253. The Mongol armies moved like a black tide over the passes. Drums thundered in the morning fog. Villages emptied before them. Rice fields burned behind them. The air grew heavy with heat and rot. Here, the open steppe ended. Here, the war would be fought in mud, water, and stone. Chongqing, a city built on cliffs, guarded by the Yangtze's coils. The Mongols came with siege towers that groaned like ships at sea. Arrows hissed upward, striking shields, piercing leather. The Song defenders poured oil and fire down the walls. The night lit like a funeral pyre. But the walls held, and Monk's patience grew sharper. Jiayu Fortress, the crown of the river. Its walls clung to the cliffs like the bones of a giant. Beneath it, the river foamed, deep and treacherous. The Mongols surrounded it. Catapults hurled stones that shattered in the air. Scaling ladders splintered under boiling water. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Each dawn, Monk walked the siege lines. Each night, the Song banners still flew above the walls. The south was no friend to the horsemen. The rains came heavy. The rivers swelled and swallowed men whole. Sickness swept the camps, fever, dysentery, heat stroke. Warriors who had ridden from the Volga now lay dying in bamboo huts. Still, the Khan did not break. Stone falls to water, he told his generals, but only if the water never stops. 1257. The Mongol advance split the Song realm. Cities surrendered rather than burn. Others fought to the last spear. The Yangtze stood between Monk and the Song capital. Its waters ran high and fast, a living wall. But the Khan had crossed deserts. He had crossed mountains. A river would not hold him. Summer 1259. The Mongol war drums shook the ground. Battering rams pounded the gates of Azhou. Trebuchets hurled firepots that burst against the walls. From the ramparts, the Song poured arrows, stones, and fire. The sky was a haze of smoke and ash. At night, the river reflected the flames, turning black water into molten gold. Monk watched from his command tent. Victory was close. He could feel it. Then the sickness came, a fever that clung to him like chains. Some whispered poison. Others said the river air had cursed him. For days, Monk lay still, listening to the battle, the thunder of siege stones, the cries of the dying. He had promised himself the south would fall, but his body betrayed him. August 11th, 1259. The Khan's tent was silent. His generals gathered outside. No one spoke. Inside, Monk lay with his eyes closed, his breath shallow. He thought of the steppes, of his grandfather's shadow, of the rivers he had not yet crossed. And then the breath was gone. The Mongol camp did not wail. It was not their way, but the drums stopped. The war engines stood unused. The siege of Azhou ended. The Song watched from their walls as the riders withdrew. They knew this was not mercy. It was a pause. Kublai heard the news in the east, Hulagu in the west. Each turned their armies toward the steppe. The empire had no Khan. The throne sat empty. The wind over the steppes carried only questions. The war in the south slept, but it was not over. When it woke, it would wake in fury. Winter air hung heavy over Mesopotamia. The Tigris moved slow, like an old serpent. On its banks, the Mongol banners advanced. Tens of thousands, riders in silence, siege engines creaking like the bones of giants. At their head, Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, a man sent to break kingdoms, not rule them. Baghdad lay ahead, the jewel of the Islamic world, the beating heart of knowledge, faith, and wealth. But the order from Karakorum was clear. It would beat no more. Inside the city, Caliph al-Mustasim stood in the golden halls. He had ruled a realm of scholars, poets, and traders, but not an army fit to face the steppe. He trusted in the city's name, in its history, in the belief that no Muslim ruler would dare destroy the seat of the Abbasids. He sent envoys to negotiate. Hulagu sent them back with their beards shaved, an insult carved into skin. The message was clear. This was not a war of tribute. It was an ending. January 1258. The Mongols ringed Baghdad like a tightening noose. To the east, siege towers rose. To the west, catapults aimed their black mouths at the walls. The Tigris was cut off. No supplies could reach the city. Drums rolled at dusk. The first stones flew at dawn. For days, the sky was filled with fire. Stones crashed into domes and minarets. The library shook. The markets burned. The walls cracked under the constant assault. Each impact a hammer against the gates of an age. Hunger grew inside the city. Fear followed. The caliph's council begged for surrender. He hesitated. The hesitation cost him everything. February 10th. A breach opened on the northern wall. The Mongols poured through. Iron against flesh. Horses trampling the fallen. The Abbasid guards fought in the streets. But the tide was too strong, too relentless. The city of 1,000,000 souls became a slaughter ground. The great library of Baghdad, home to centuries of science, medicine, poetry, and history. Its scrolls were thrown into the Tigris. The ink bled into the river until the waters ran black. Witnesses swore the river carried the weight of an entire civilization's memory. And the river, like history, did not give it back. Hulagu summoned al-Mustasim. The caliph came in chains, dressed in the robes of his office. Hulagu spoke no long judgment, no speech, only an order. The caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled under the hooves of Mongol horses. No royal blood touched the ground. The dynasty of the Abbasids, 5 centuries old, ended in the dust. Baghdad burned for days. The smell of death clung to the air. Survivors walked among the ruins, silent as ghosts. The mosques stood cracked. The markets were empty. The streets, once crowded with scholars and merchants, were rivers of ash. The Islamic Golden Age, born in light, ended in fire. When Hulagu finally rode out, there was nothing left to rule. The city was a tomb. Behind him, the Tigris flowed on, carrying ashes and ink toward the sea. Ahead of him lay new campaigns, new kingdoms to break. But for the world, something greater had fallen than stone walls. An age had been murdered, and the wound would not heal. Khan was dead. Monk's body lay in Karakorum, shrouded in silk, guarded by warriors who had followed him across continents. His death was more than the loss of a ruler. It was the cracking of the sky. From China to the Caspian, the messengers rode. The empire must choose a new ruler. But the brothers of the house of Genghis were not united. Kublai, a commander in the south, pressing deep into Song China. A man of vision, cities, trade, law. Eric Boke, the younger brother in the homeland. A son of the steppe, loyal to the old ways, the eternal yurts, the endless herds. They did not trust each other, and neither would yield. The Kurultai, the great council, was called. But even the gathering of the princes was poisoned by suspicion. 2 councils formed. 2 proclamations, 2 great Khans. The writers carried both decrees across the empire. Every camp, every city, every army had to choose. The air grew thick with the scent of coming war. The heart of the empire turned on itself. Steppe warriors clashed with steppe warriors. The same battle cries, now answered with arrows. The Silk Road, once a lifeline, became a battlefield. Caravans burned. Cities were taken and taken again. Hulagu in Persia supported Kublai. Bada's heirs in the west leaned toward Erik Bok. The unity that had carried the Mongols from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea dissolved like snow in spring. The war did not end with one final battle. It bled out into exhaustion. By 1264, Erik Bok surrendered to Kublai. But the damage was done. The empire was still vast, but no longer whole. The 4 great khanates stood apart. The Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai. The Ilkhanate in Persia under Hulagu's line. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. The Golden Horde in the Western Steppes. One name, 4 thrones, and between them, distance, distrust, and silence. At night, old warriors whispered around their campfires. They remember the days when one command could move 1,000,000 men, when the standard of the great Khan flew above all banners. Now, each Khan called himself heir to Genghis, but the soul of the empire had split. The legend remained. The power did not. Kublai ruled from his palace in Khanbaliq. He dressed in silk, received envoys from Europe, sent fleets into distant seas. But in the steppe, the yurts turned away from him. They said he had grown too close to the ways of the Chinese, that the steppe no longer ruled the empire. The empire ruled the steppe. The Golden Horde looked west to their own wars. The Chagatai fought among themselves. The Ilkhanate built its own court in Tabriz. The empire of Genghis now lived as a memory carried by the wind. The Mongol world still roared. Its armies still crushed kingdoms. Its name still carried fear. But the unity that had made them unstoppable was gone. The cracks had become borders. The borders would become walls. And somewhere in the silence of the steppe, the ghost of the great Khan rode alone. A vast map lit by 4 distant fires, each burning on its own, none strong enough to light the whole world. The steppe winds carried the scent of war and empire. Kublai Khan sat beneath a canopy of black felt, the standard of Genghis fluttering above him. The civil war with Erik Bok was over, but victory had a price. The empire was fractured. The heart of the Mongol world now lay far to the east, in the lands of China. Kublai knew this. He knew the future would not be won on the open steppe. It would be won in the cities. It would be won in stone. China was divided. In the north, the Mongols ruled under the old Yuan claim. In the south, the Song dynasty still held their rivers and cities, their scholars, and their fleets. For generations, they had resisted the Mongol storm. Now Kublai would end it. But to rule China was not only to conquer it. It was to be accepted by its people, to carry the mandate of heaven. Kublai studied Chinese law. He wore Chinese robes at court. He summoned scholars and engineers, Buddhist monks and Taoist sages. Some of his generals whispered that he was turning his back on the steppe. Kublai replied only with silence and orders for his armies to march south. The Song fought like a cornered tiger. Their walls were high. Their rivers were shields. Their navy ruled the Yangtze. Kublai's armies had to cross water as much as land. Ships were built in the thousands. Bridges of boats stretched across vast currents. In the winter, the Mongols froze the rivers to march over them. In the summer, they sent fire ships down to burn the Song fleets. The war was slow. Years passed. Cities fell one by one, each a stone removed from the last wall of the Song. Xiangyang was the key, the gateway to the southern heartlands. For years, it defied the Mongols. The walls were thick, the defenders relentless. Kublai brought engineers from the west, Persians who built great counterweight trebuchets. The stones they hurled shattered towers. The sound was like thunder rolling across the plain. The siege broke the city. and with it, the gates to the south swung open. By 1276, the Song court fled to the sea. The boy emperor, no more than a child, was carried from port to port. The Mongols followed like a shadow that never lifted. At last, in 1279, at Yamen, the final Song fleet faced the Mongol navy. The sea was choked with ships. Arrows darkened the sky. The Song admiral chained his ships together, determined never to surrender. The Mongols set fire to the chain. The smoke covered the water. When it cleared, the Song fleet was gone. The boy emperor had leapt into the sea with his courtiers, choosing death over capture. The Song dynasty was no more. In the halls of Khanbaliq, Kublai took the imperial seal. The Yuan dynasty was declared. For the first time in history, all of China was under foreign rule. The steppe horseman had become the son of heaven. He reformed the tax system, built roads and canals, expanded trade to Persia, India, even the distant courts of Europe. The Silk Road blazed with caravans once more. From the forests of Siberia to the ports of the South China Sea, one empire held the routes. But rule brought burdens. The Mongol elite grumbled at his Chinese ways. The Chinese gentry saw him as a conqueror, not a rightful ruler. He spent fortunes on palaces, gardens, and fleets for distant invasions. Some failed. The storms of Japan swallowed whole armies. The empire was vast, but its edges frayed. In the west, the Ilkhanate and Golden Horde fought their own wars, ignoring Kublai's decrees. The unity of Genghis's empire was gone. In the quiet hours, Kublai would walk alone in his palace gardens. The wind in the pines reminded him of the steppe, of a younger time, when the world seemed to open before his grandfather's riders. He had done what Genghis could not, conquered all of China, but he could not bring the empire back together. Victory had a different taste now. It was heavy. It lingered. Kublai Khan was the last to rule as Great Khan in more than name. After him, the title would be a shadow. The Mongol Empire would live on in fragments, each khanate drifting into its own destiny. But for a moment, in those years between 1279 and the close of his reign, the world's largest empire and the richest kingdom on earth were one. Kublai had stood at the crossroads of the steppe and the Middle Kingdom. He had chosen to build, not just to conquer. And in that choice, he had written a chapter that even the ghost of Genghis might have paused to read. The great Khan seated in silk and gold, the imperial seal in his hand. Outside, the drums of the Yuan court echo through the night, a sound that carries from the walls of Khanbaliq to the farthest bend of the Yangtze. The age of conquest was ending. The age of rule had begun. The sun rose over the northern plain. Kublai Khan rode slowly, surveying the city he had claimed, Khanbaliq. The walls stretched like a promise into the horizon. The air smelled of earth and timber. Construction dust mingled with incense from distant temples. This would be the heart of the Yuan dynasty, the place where the steppe met China, where the horseman would rule in the shadow of dragons. He dismounted, boots sinking into the packed soil. Engineers, scholars, laborers moved like ants around him. Every stone placed with purpose. Every gate aligned with the stars. The city was more than a capital. It was a statement. Kublai's vision carved in brick and timber. The palace rose above the city, vast and silent. Silk banners flapped against jade towers. Courtyards gleamed with white marble. Monks chanted in distant corridors. The emperor walked alone through the halls. He was a Mongol, yet he wore the robes of Chinese emperors. He carried the weight of the past and the future. Genghis's legacy pressed against him like a shadow. Every decision echoed across continents. His advisors spoke of law, trade, and military campaigns. Kublai listened. He measured their words. Every decree was an act of creation. Every law, a step toward unity. The city pulsed with life. Merchants shouted across bustling streets. Silks and spices, porcelain and jade. Caravans moved along the canals like arteries of the empire. Kublai walked among them, unseen, a silent observer. He watched farmers trade grain for coins. He watched craftsmen hammering metal into tools and weapons. He imagined the empire expanding through these people, through these streets. He knew power was not only won with armies. It was held with roads, with rivers, with the lifeblood of cities. And Beijing would be the pulse of his reign. In the council chamber, Kublai gathered generals and ministers. Maps stretched across tables. Ink and compass traced borders he had yet to conquer. Some questioned his decisions. Others feared his ambition. He did not flinch. He ruled not with intimidation alone, but with vision. He sent armies south to suppress resistance. He ordered fleets north to patrol the seas. He built bridges across rivers and roads across mountains. Every measure was a knot tying China closer to the Mongol heart. At dusk, Kublai climbed the tower of the palace. The city sprawled beneath him, lanterns flickering like stars fallen to earth. The wind carried the scent of firewood, river water, and distant mountains. He thought of the steppe, the endless grass, and the silence of the horizon. He thought of Genghis, of the empire's birth in dust and blood, and he felt the weight of their dreams. The Yuan dynasty was new. The capital was alive. But history would judge him not only as a conqueror, but as a builder, a unifier, a man between worlds. Kublai's reign would last decades. The city would endure beyond him. Walls, canals, and roads would carry his vision forward. Yet he remained a Mongol on Chinese soil, forever balancing the horseman's instinct with the emperor's duty. Each day was a test of loyalty, of patience, of wisdom. Each night, he walked alone, contemplating the empire he had welded from steel and stone, blood and fire. The lanterns glowed, the city breathed, and Kublai Khan, standing over it all, understood the fragile weight of rule. Beijing sprawls beneath a twilight sky. The great Khan atop the palace tower, the wind in his robes, his eyes on the horizon. A Mongol heart beats within the stone walls of China. The age of conquest continues, but now the age of governance has begun. The wind blew cold across the imperial city. Lanterns flickered along empty streets. The gates, once proud, sagged under neglect. The walls whispered of past glories. Mongol governors sat in opulent halls, yet the coffers were bare. Rebellions simmered in the countryside. The people's eyes burned with discontent. The great Khan was gone. His heirs struggled to fill the shadow he left. Ambition had become arrogance. Strength had become decay. Inside the palace, courtiers whispered in dark corridors. Plots formed like storms on the horizon. Factions rose against factions. Corruption festered in gilded chambers. Officials hoarded grain while the populace starved. Taxes crushed the peasantry. Droughts and floods swept across the land. The dynasty's pulse faltered. A young general knelt before the emperor. "I cannot defend what cannot be saved," he said. The words hung in the hall, truth heavier than iron. Villages burned in the night. Farmers and rebels took up arms with whatever they could wield. Axes, knives, pitchforks. The people no longer feared the Mongol overlords. Every city taken by fire, every wall broken, was a signal. The dynasty's grip weakened. Kublai's dream of unity had fractured into dust. Rivers ran red. Lanterns were extinguished. And still, the rebellion grew. A figure emerged from the south. Zhu Yuanzhang, a man born in poverty, tempered by famine and war. He rallied the oppressed. Every village, every town, became a node in his growing power. He marched north, his army disciplined, relentless. Mongol forces tried to resist. They faltered. Internal strife had hollowed their strength. The emperor watched from his palace tower. The walls no longer offered protection. The throne seemed distant, unattainable. The empire was unraveling before his eyes. The final city fell under siege. Beijing trembled. Lanterns swayed in the wind, reflecting chaos below. Zhu's forces breached the gates. Mongol generals surrendered. The last emperor fled into the hills. The dynasty that had stretched across Asia, that had carved kingdoms from the steppe to the sea, collapsed into history. Kublai's dream of an enduring Yuan dynasty had ended. Yet the echoes of his rule lingered in canals, roads, and walls. The Mongol spirit endured, scattered, diminished, but unbroken. The sun set over the capital, bleeding red over the rooftops. Smoke rose from distant fires. A dynasty that had once commanded the wind and the horse now faded into legend. The Ming Dynasty would rise, yet the memory of the Mongols remained etched in stone and soul, a testament to ambition, conquest, and the fragile nature of power. Beijing stood, scarred but alive. The steppe warriors were gone, but their shadow lingered. The empire had fallen. The story of its rise and decline was now a whisper on the wind, a cautionary tale of glory and mortality. Lanterns burn low. Smoke curls against the night sky. Beijing waits. The Mongol dynasty is gone, but its legend rides the wind forever. Stretched endlessly. Grass waved like an ocean of green. Horses once thundered across this land. Now only wind remained. Yet the memory of empire lingered. The Golden Horde ruled from the western reaches of the Mongol legacy. Its khans held sway over rivers and plains. Forts guarded the steppe. Caravans moved cautiously, weighed by fear and tribute. Europe watched, wary. Princes sent envoys with gold and gifts. The shadow of the horde reached beyond rivers and forests. It whispered of conquest, yet also of law and order. The Mongols' hand was invisible, but it guided every step. The empire had fractured, for khanates now traced the old world. Yet the spirit of conquest refused to die. The Golden Horde faced internal strife. Brothers fought brothers. Alliances shifted like sand under the wind. Cities rebelled. Merchants and soldiers alike balanced on a knife's edge. And in the east, another shadow emerged. Timur, Tamerlane, ambitious, ruthless, destined. A man who studied the rise and fall of khans. He saw weakness, and he moved with purpose. Timur's gaze swept Central Asia. Samarkand rose under his vision. He rebuilt cities with stone, with gold, with fear. Artisans and soldiers alike bowed to his will. He remembered the Mongols, their strategies, their terror, their genius. He learned, adapted, and surpassed. Armies marched like the steppe wind. Sieges shattered walls. Fortresses fell. Rivers ran red. Yet Timur was not merely a destroyer. He was a builder, a planner, a ruler with eyes on eternity. He wanted not just land, but legacy. The Golden Horde trembled under Timur's shadow. For decades, they had ruled with subtle terror. Now a new storm approached. Skirmishes ignited across plains. Rivers and forests became battlefields. Armies met with thunder, arrows like rain. Horses screamed. Men cried, dust blinded. The Horde's khans fought valiantly. But Timur's tactics were unprecedented. He exploited division, exploited pride. The past glory of the Mongols could not save them. Yet victory was never complete. Every battle left scars on both the land and soul. The steppe remembered each scream. Samarkand and Bokhara became theaters of vision and terror. Walls fell. Markets burned. Scholars fled. Timur's shadow spread like night over the plains. The Golden Horde tried to respond. Fortresses were reinforced. Armies regrouped. Yet the cohesion that Genghis had demanded centuries before had eroded. Europe watched from afar. Russia braced for invasion. The Horde's authority waned. The memory of invincibility faded. Even amid slaughter, treaties emerged. Alliances were fragile. The Horde negotiated with Timur when it could. Timur offered terms, then reneged. The world learned the Mongol lesson. Loyalty was a currency, fear another. Merchants adapted. Trade continued despite carnage. Silk and silver moved through devastated lands. The Mongol legacy was paradoxical. Destruction and connection intertwined. Internal rivalries tore the Horde further apart. Provinces asserted independence. Khanates splintered. Europe and Persia saw opportunity. Princes tested borders. Cities defied tribute. Yet the Horde's shadow remained. Even fractured, it influenced diplomacy, warfare, and commerce. The world had learned the Mongol rhythm: swift, calculated, ruthless. Timur's campaigns reshaped Asia. Cities burned, yet rose again stronger. Roads were rebuilt. Trade flourished. Knowledge moved along the arteries once opened by the Mongols. He studied Mongol strategy, but he was his own legend. Flawed, ambitious, unstoppable. He would be remembered as both conqueror and architect. His victories over the Golden Horde cemented his fame. Yet he never fully united the Mongol lands. Fragmentation persisted, a shadow of Genghis' dream. Europe and Persia were altered forever. Russian principalities consolidated. Persian art, architecture, and administration adapted Mongol methods. Trade and warfare were informed by steppe legacy. The Mongol shadow was subtle but persistent. Even in decline, it taught rulers how to govern, armies how to fight, and merchants how to survive. Timur exemplified both continuity and change. The past informed the future, but the future had its own path. The steppe wind swept across open plains. Horses still grazed where empires had marched. The Golden Horde had faded. Timur had risen and passed. Yet the world was forever altered. Borders bore the scars of conquest. Trade routes traced the veins of empire. Ideas moved faster, carried by the memory of Mongol organization and Timur's vision. Legends endure. Conquest leaves more than death. It leaves architecture, law, commerce, and memory. The steppe whispers still. The Mongols shaped nations. Timur reshaped empires. And in the endless horizon of history, the shadow of the steppe rides on. The wind swept across the steppes. It carried dust, whispers, and memory. The horses no longer thundered in conquest, yet their shadows lingered. Grass grew over abandoned camps, yet the earth remembered. Borders had shifted. Rivers marked new kingdoms. Mountains had witnessed countless battles. Mongol swords had carved nations, and those marks had not faded. Trade routes once patrolled by mounted couriers now carried silk, silver, and ideas. Caravans moved like veins of the old empire. Merchants followed paths first opened by the horde. The world had grown smaller, stitched together by fear, ambition, and vision. Cities rose along the Silk Road. Samarkand, Beijing, Baghdad. Walls bore inscriptions. Markets hummed with life. The Mongols' reach had been total, yet their influence endured in the invisible threads they left behind. Knowledge flowed across continents. Maps grew more accurate. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, all carried forward along the paths of conquest. The world, once fragmented, now moved in rhythm with the pulse of the steppe. Legends told of Genghis, Badu, Kublai, and Timur. Stories passed from merchant to traveler, from father to son. Not all were heroes, not all were kind, but all left a mark that time could not erase. The empire had splintered centuries ago, for khanates, then smaller kingdoms. Yet their spirit endured. In the Golden Horde, the Yuan, the Chagatai, and Ilkhanate, echoes of unity persisted. The Mongols' laws, their yam system, influenced governance far beyond the steppe. Messengers could move faster than armies. Orders traveled farther than kings' decrees. The principle endured, a single vision imposed across vast, diverse lands. Even in decline, even in chaos, the world remembered what it meant to be governed by the shadow of Genghis. In Europe, the memory was fear. The tales of fiery cities and shattered armies lingered. Poland, Hungary, Russia, all had felt the weight of the horde. Yet trade and diplomacy followed. Mongol influence shaped armies and strategies. Political borders shifted in response to campaigns. Kings and princes learned to negotiate with the ghosts of the steppe. Even absence carried power. The West had survived, but it had been transformed. Fear had sparked innovation. Cities fortified. Cavalry refined. Maps rewritten. In China, the Yuan left more than terror. Architecture, governance, and trade bore Mongol imprint. Beijing remained the capital. Palaces, walls, and canals carried their hand. The dynasty fell, yet ideas persisted. Merchants prospered. Silk, tea, spices. The world had grown interconnected. The Mongol vision of expansion had created arteries of civilization. Goods, people, and thought moved faster than ever before. Historians noted the brutality, yet they also noted the structure, the order, and the astonishing scope. Legacy was never simple. Timur rose from the ashes of the Mongol Empire, a new conqueror, yet one who mirrored their vision. Central Asia trembled under his campaigns. Cities burned, but the Silk Road thrived. The world learned that conquest and commerce were inseparable. Empires rose, fell, and reformed. The Mongol model, swift, centralized, yet adaptable, influenced rulers for centuries. The echoes of the steppes shaped the battlefield and the marketplace alike. Mongol influence was not only war. It was art, language, and culture. Letters and scripts adapted to new tongues. Poetry traveled alongside swords. Music echoed the cadence of the steppe. Religions spread with the armies. Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity all found new routes. The empire had destroyed, yet it had connected. Civilizations grew from the collisions, absorbing and reshaping one another. Today, the Mongols are a shadow, yet their borders echo in Russia, China, and Central Asia. Names, laws, and strategies trace back to the steppe. Even in modern warfare, logistics learned from Mongol methods endure. Historians debate their brutality, their genius, and their mistakes. The steppe sons were flawed, yet destiny seemed intertwined with their ambition. They shaped trade, politics, and the very perception of empire. Horses still roam the Mongolian plains. The wind still carries whispers of past glory. Children listen to tales of warriors and conquerors. Maps show countries that owe their shape to conquest and diplomacy. Legacy is complex. It is blood and commerce. It is terror and vision. It is the fleeting shadow of a man who dreamed of uniting the world on horseback. The Mongols are gone, yet the world they remade still breathes. And every time a caravan crosses a distant desert, or a ruler studies the art of war, the ghost of the steppe rides with them. Empires rise, empires fall. Conquest is temporary. Trade endures. Memory persists. Genghis Khan's shadow is long. It stretches across centuries, across continents, across the very way we think about borders, commerce, and power. The Mongol Empire is not just history. It is the pulse beneath modern civilization. A reminder, greatness can be forged, shattered, and reborn, but its echoes remain. The wind sweeps the steppes. It carries dust, whispers, and memory. And somewhere in that endless horizon, the horses still thunder.